Hello and welcome! I'm very excited for today's video because we're talking about a manhwa for the first time on this channel. We're talking about Martial Peak. Now, Martial Peak is not finished yet. I should definitely specify that here. We're 6,009 chapters into the novel, but only about 3,100 chapters into the manhwa, which is what I'm reading. And you may say, Trey, I don't know what a manhwa is. I just read manga. That's okay. Manhwa are Chinese comic books, much as manga are Japanese comics. So, what makes Martial Peak special, in my mind? Martial Peak is really interesting, even though it follows a very set structure. Martial Peak's structure is Yang Kai, the main character, who I love, is not very strong. He gets stronger. He climbs his way up the ladder. Then he's at the top of the ladder. He takes vengeance on all those that ever hurt him or his people. And then he moves on to the next area where he's no longer at the top of the ladder again, and he's back at the bottom. And it just kind of repeats in that way. And I could see some people being like, oh, I wish it didn't repeat. I wish it was just that journey the first time, and then there we were. But personally, I really like that it repeats, because it means I get all aspects of Yang Kai's character multiple times. I get that punk kid that is not strong enough to stand up for himself, but wants to, and has to try and work his way forward and play people the right way to be able to get what he wants, to slowly increase his strength, and then suddenly now he's able to fight back against the people that were oppressing him before, and now he's moving back up, and now he's at this mid-rank area, and then finally he's back at the top rank, and nobody can stop him, and he's crushing his enemies. Again, if you're not somebody that likes wuxia, you might not like this style, but if you've never read a manhwa before, I also think because it repeats that cycle so many times, Martial Peak is a great entry into manhwa as well. Now, there's a couple big things that we need to highlight here. There are a couple problems that come from the structure that Martial Peak uses. The main one being, there are some really cool and interesting characters that never come back again. So, when Yang Kai reaches the highest peak of his current realm of cultivation, he will then move to the next one. And that means he'll meet a bunch of new characters, and there can be some really interesting people there, and it's awesome. But some of the old characters will move up with him, right? And some of them won't. And so some of my favorite characters are way back at like third year in the first set of cultivation levels, and they're never coming back again, right? That we're just never gonna see them again. And that's kind of a shame. I think in and of itself as a whole, I understand why that happens. You can't bring everybody up to them levels because then your cast is just exorbitantly big. But on the other hand of it, I do like when older characters return. I think that's a really cool thing, especially since, you know, some of them are still technically around. They're just not there all the time. A couple other little things that I want to highlight, such as Yang Kai continues to get stronger, and that's great. But over the course of the series, I guess very light spoilers, he marries a handful of women, and they're all really cool for the most part. There's only one that I don't love, and I don't want to spoil names here, but there's only one that I don't love. All the rest of them I like quite a bit, and one of them is my big favorite. I love her. And they always have like a period of time before they get to come up to the levels. So there can be a long period of time where just like, yeah, that character's just not around. And it's cool. I understand why. We need to keep the story moving forward. It's about Yang Kai and his search for the Martial Peak of the Tao. But I kind of miss having those characters around. I thought it was cool when Yang Kai had a posse of them. And so each time he goes to the next areas, he gets a new posse and they're cool. But I miss those characters in particular. Those are special among all the people that I think get left behind. But again, I understand why the structure's that way. It's just something I want to make sure you know going into the story. Now, I haven't really talked about what Martial Peak is about, other than just like this is the structure that it follows. Martial Peak is about Yang Kai's search for the Martial Peak. It is his attempts to reach the pinnacle of cultivation and become the best that there's ever been, like no one ever was, right? And so, over the course of this journey, he will collect all of these awesome wuxia treasures, some of which through sheer luck, most of which through hard work and dedication, that eventually let him be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with the greats of the realm that he's in at that time. Marshall Peak has a really solid structure in the way of, as I said, the repeating cycle almost, but also of there are some things that you're just going to get used to with Marshall Peak. The author of Marshall Peak loves his idioms. He loves his proverbs, right? So you'll have people saying, "Brat, don't be forced to, don't come for a toast only to be forced to drink a loss," or "You'll die a dog's death," or "This old master will make sure you don't make it through the day," or "Today in a year will be your death anniversary." And you just go down the list, right? I find it super charming, but I also love wuxia. It's a genre that I really enjoy. So even though you're going to get way more of the idioms here than you would in other wuxia stories, I find it really charming every time I see it. Things like, we've been through fire and water together. What is this? I really like this story, even if it can, by a lot of people's metrics, be really simple, right? I almost said by a lot of people's margins. I guess that works too. But Yang Kai as a character is pretty interesting to me. He is the wuxia, he's the titular wuxia hero, right? He is always going to help people that need help. He is always going to do the right thing for people that are doing the right thing. But a villain will get no mercy, and anyone that harms him or his people will be killed without regret. He is that wuxia hero, right? He also is a little bit of a womanizer, but he always does right by them. He always makes sure that they get married to him, I guess. I don't know if that's exactly what they all wanted right away, but he doesn't force them to marry him. I'm wording this in a really poor way. It's just that he is always interested in more women, but he's actually way more true to his wives than I expected him to be based on that. He's extremely flirty, is probably the right way to put it. But if they reciprocate, he will take care of them. Now, this does not mean that he is completely upright all the time. He has no qualms about killing anybody who gets in his way. And he will often go too far to his own detriment and make a bunch of enemies in his attempts to get revenge. He is not somebody that forgives easily, if at all, and it lends itself to the story, I think, in a lot of ways, because it means you're always going to have those bigger sects coming to crush down Yang Kai or try to kill Yang Kai because he's overstretched himself. It's really hard to talk about Marshall Peak without getting into specific characters, because other than his wives and his parents and a couple other characters, everybody's kind of expendable in a way. Each arc, there'll be some really interesting characters that he attaches to that I cannot stop these hiccups. I'm so sorry. That he attaches to that are really cool and really important to him, and they don't ever become less important to him, right? He will go above and beyond and put himself in harm's way to go save people from arcs ago. But they kind of fall out of the story in a way that makes it where it's kind of hard to talk about them. Without getting into too many spoilers, I'll talk about Old Demon real quick, which is a character that Yang Kai teams up with pretty early on in the story that unfortunately does kind of just get forgotten because the story moves on past him in a way that it's a shame. But he's kind of like the poster boy for that. Of, if you had told me when he was introduced there would ever be a time where Old Demon was not around, I would have told you were crazy. Old Demon is one of the most important characters in the series. And then by chapter 3100, Old Demon has not been talked about for arcs. He is just God. And so, as much as I love this series, I can't say it's without its flaws. And yet, I find myself coming back to Marshall Peak over and over and over again. The way that the treasures work, things like the soul-warming lotus or the golden dragon spear, things like the time fly seals or the world boundary. There's so much cool wuxia powers and treasures in this series, and almost everywhere Yang Kai goes, he finds something cool that either he can use or somebody he knows can use because he's dedicated to find those treasures. It's just, yes, it is repetitive, and that could be a problem for a lot of people, but for me, this is a great, hey, I got a couple minutes, I'm gonna read a couple chapters, I'm I'm going to see what Yankai's up to now. I'm going to see what trouble he's got into now. I'm going to see where this goes now. And surprisingly, there are some story arcs that I found really affecting. Things like the Star Boundary and the Demon War. Things like the Great Emperor's arc. All of that was really, really good. And although I feel like the story probably could have stopped at the end of the Great Emperor's arc, I think that for the most part, it goes really well from there too. There's some really cool stuff that happens later on. Marshall Peak, like I said, it's a really weird series to talk about. I've re-recorded this video like 4 times now because I've just rambled the whole way through, and I'm not going to do that this time. I'm not going to re-record it again. We're going to take this take, and I'll edit around it, and we'll call it good. But on the whole, Marshall Peak is just a really enjoyable read. I don't think the story is necessarily anything super to write home about, but I think there are story beats that are very, very good. And I think it's the characterization, not just of Yankai, but also of his family, of the women that he winds up falling in love with, that are all really cool for the most part. Again, there's just that one that I don't want to name that if you're up to 3100, you probably agree with me. It's not that she's done anything bad, it's that she kind of just hasn't done anything compared to all the rest that are, like, I don't want to spoil too much. One of them has, like, dedicated herself so much to him that for multiple lifetimes she's been wrapped up, not just in him, but he's been wrapped up in her. And they're really cool characters, and I wish they got to stick around more because they're very cool in their own right. It's not just, hey, they're Yankai's wives. I think other than that one, they're all really, really interesting characters that all have their own Tao that they're searching for, all on their own. Just let them be more of the story. I miss them. All told, I really like Marshall Peak. I'm going to keep reading it for sure. We'll do a full review once it's finished. I just wanted to kind of touch base here 3,100 chapters in, because I've read 3,100 chapters of Marshall Peak, and I hadn't made a video on it yet. And at some point, we'll probably go back and do individual arc reviews where we get into the spoilers for the arcs. Just because, again, I do really like this story. Yeah, I miss the Blood Warriors. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And until next time, I've been Trey. This has been The Full Spectrum. Remember to always enjoy the full spectrum that Marshall Peak has to offer.